Well, Mr. Hudson,
Tom, please.
well, Tom, I understand that you came to Acworth about 1947, and you were, what, 4 years old at that time, I guess?
My first memory of Acworth is coming down the road that later became Highway 92 and seeing the huge gouge of red clay where the lake was going to be.
I bet. Yeah. And what brought your family to Acworth?
Well, my father had been running movie theaters for a chain called Martin Theaters. It was a southern chain, theaters all over the South. And at the time the war broke out, he was running a theater in Childersburg, Alabama. And he finally got caught by the draft. So in 1943, he got shipped off to Europe to serve in the Army. My mother and my older brother and I got sent down to a little town called Atmore, Alabama, which was a rural farm town down right on the Florida border with Alabama, and about 60 miles due east of Mobile. And we spent the time down there while Daddy was in the war, we stayed down there with my mother's folks. When he came back from the war, you'll remember the GI Bill then said your employer had to give you your job back or a comparable job. So Martin Theaters, by the way, it was owned by Daddy's cousin, Edie Martin. Martin Theaters offered Daddy the choice of a Huntsville, Alabama theater or the Acworth, Georgia theater, and he picked Acworth.
So you came to Acworth, and why don't you talk a little bit about your parents? Your father ran the Legion Theater for a number of years, and then will you tell the story about it?
I will, thank you. My father was a hard working man, one of the hardest working people I've ever known. He tended to have a little bit of a brown thumb when it came to business, but he was a hard worker. He started running the Legion downtown, and you'll recall that Acworth was originally a mill town and was an active mill town at the time Daddy moved here. And the theater business could get kind of interesting in a mill town on Saturday night. So people would get a little bit happy on the weekends and sometimes a little bit rowdy. But Cecil had been in the service, and he had been a sergeant in the service, and he basically didn't take a lot of crap off of much of anybody. So Daddy ran the theater there. We were open, I think, 7 days a week. He would show sort of second run, third run movies because we couldn't afford to rent the really expensive brand new releases. On Saturdays, we were basically the babysitting service for the town because he would have 2 or 3 westerns, odors we called them, and a couple of serials and a bunch of cartoons. And I think the cost of admission was something like a dime or 12 cents or some such thing. So the families from around town would come and dump the kids on us, and we'd have them for the whole day, basically.
What'd you call the movies?
Odors.
Odors?
Yeah, cowboy movies are sometimes called odors.
Okay.
You may not work crossword puzzles, but I do, and that's a frequent clue you see in crossword puzzles. So the television was coming along at about that time, and Martin Theaters decided that small-town theaters were not going to be the wave of the future, and they offered to sell their theaters to the people who were managing them. And my father, who was always an optimistic sort of fellow, decided that he would buy it, and he did. So he bought the theater. I don't remember the exact year, but it was early, probably 52, 3, 4, right in there. So he bought the theater and owned it from that point forward. And after about probably 2 or 3 years later, he decided that what Acworth really needed was a drive-in theater. So he went out on the edge of town and bought a bunch of acres out on the edge of town and built a drive-in theater. And the drive-in theater is a story all by itself. I was telling somebody earlier that Daddy was like all these guys who came back from World War II, a lot of them at least. After beating the German army in nasty weather, marching halfway across Europe with equipment that didn't work half the time, these guys came home and they sort of felt like they could do anything that needed to be done. And so when we moved here, the first thing Daddy did was to build his own house out on Lakeshore Drive. I wouldn't know where to start about building my own house. Mm-hmm. But he built the drive-in theater from scratch. Mm-hmm. He bought this plot of land that had what you would only call a hill, had a steep hill like so. You know, most drive-in theaters are built on gently rolling. You start at the back row and you go down, 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 down. Not Daddy's. It was like so. And so he brought in bulldozers and carved rows in this hill. I think 8 of them. And then covered the roads with gravel because it was all red clay. Covered the roads with gravel and then stuck railroad ties in front so the cars wouldn't drive off the steep drops that were left.
Okay.
It didn't help much because you get somebody who was either real familiar or real unfamiliar or real forgetful or who had had too many adult beverages. About once every 2 weeks, somebody pull over and nosedive into the road below. So Daddy had an old World War II Jeep, and we'd pull them out and set them on their way. But the funniest part of the drive-in theater was the screen. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody told me, go over there and build a drive-in movie screen, I have no idea how I'd start. What do you do? Where do you? Well, Daddy sank, I think, 6 telephone poles, built a lattice work of 2x4s on it, nailed on those 2x4s 1/4-inch thick asbestos 4x4 foot panels. And that became his drive-in theater screen. Ingenious, except when the wind blew. The wind was not kind to Daddy's drive-in theater screen. And so occasionally he'd have a hole over here, or a hole over here, or a hole there and there. And what he would do, he'd open anyway because people would come, and he'd just screw down the lens on the camera so that the movie image would shrink to there, and then he'd put it over in this bottom right-hand corner of this. Okay. So the whole thing was just a constant embarrassment to me. Like teenagers are always embarrassed by their parents. I mean, the place was a mess. It was red clay, a little brick block concession stand where I made the popcorn. Occasionally we get visited by a rattlesnake in the concession stand. I mean, and I got to clean up the place every morning. And you don't need an education if you've cleaned up a drive-in theater the morning after. So in any event, the place was just, spent most of my young life being mortified by the drive-in theater until maybe 50 years later, and I was doing a construction project and thinking about my daddy and thinking about who does that? Who builds their own theater? And I have a complete change of heart at this point about what I think about Daddy and the drive-in.
Was the clientele a lot of high school kids taking their dates there?
Well, it was pretty much a mix of everybody. We had a lot of high schoolers. We always had folks trying to sneak in. I just, as I read the book by Walter Flanagan, Walter has a section in his book where he talks about driving up to the back row on his bicycle and sitting there without buying a ticket. So it was, and people would sneak in the trunks of cars and stuff like that. So we had a little bit of that kind of fun.
Yeah. Tell me about the Legion Theater. What did it look like inside? How big was it? And what kind of screen was in there?
Well, I'm not sure I know the technical aspects of, I would guess that it held maybe 200 people. Maybe 180, something like that. It had an upstairs balcony and it had a downstairs. The upstairs balcony was divided into a white section, which could be reached from the downstairs lobby, and a black section, African American section, that was reached by a stairway that came up from the street. So, typical Southern segregation stuff. So, and I don't recall anything special about the screen. I do recall the projectors, because they were fearsome looking things. Each projector probably stood 5.5 or 6 feet tall, big barrel middle like this. And the projectors, the way they created light was that there were 2 rods, what would they have been, carbon rods, mounted like so, and you used mechanisms to run them together, and an electrical current popped through them. When that electrical current appeared, you separated the rods a little bit, and you had a tremendous fire, basically. Wow. And a big reflector back here that blew the light out the front of the camera. I never learned to run those things, thank goodness, but my older brother learned how to run the projectors and had that job for a while. I had all the soft jobs, like taking tickets and selling popcorn and stuff like that.
So the whole family worked on all those?
Oh, yeah. I got my Social Security card when I was 6, I think.
Okay. Was there a separate projection room behind the?
Yes, it was behind the balcony, up slightly above the balcony. Mm-hmm. And there was a downstairs. I have no idea much of it. Daddy had an office down there, but that's where he used to do his painting. Mm-hmm. Now, lettering. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, you think about theaters today, you think about a marquee sitting out front and the names up in lights and that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. What we had by way of a marquee, there was an area that covered the sidewalk a little bit, and underneath that there was a sign that was about 10 feet long and about 2 feet deep that hung underneath that marquee. And Daddy had to do the lettering for the signs. They didn't come with the movies. He had to do his own. Mm-hmm. So he became a pretty fair letterer over time. But he always had this marketing bent, so he decided at some point in life that he could probably get a little more mileage out of his signs if he would intentionally misspell a word or two. So, he would do Gone with the Wind and misspell. Actually, we never showed a film as nice as that one, but he would show The Greatest Show on Earth and misspell greatest. Uh-huh. And then people would be talking all around town for the next 2 or 3 days about how dumb Cecil had misspelled The Greatest Show on Earth, but at least it got people talking. That was Daddy's theory anyway. But he got so good at lettering that people around town would pay him to do the lettering. And the fellow who owned the local, I don't recall his name, but a fellow owned the local milk delivery operation. And he bought a new truck and needed to have it painted. So he asked Daddy if he would paint on the door, milk, pasteurized and homogenized. So Daddy bring the truck over to Daddy's place, and he paints as instructed: milk, pasteurized, and hogamized.
Hogamized.
I don't think anybody. That truck trundled around Acworth for the next 15 years. I don't think anybody ever noticed it except my mother.
So he didn't do that deliberately, that's how he thought it was spelled?
I don't know to this day whether he intentionally misspelled it out of his attempt to provide a little marketing muscle for the guy.
Sounds more like marketing muscle.
Yeah, it could have been. Now you'd ask about my parents, and I've told you about my father. Right. Let me spend a minute or two telling you about
Absolutely.
my mother. My mother was born in this little town of Atmore down on the Alabama line. Uh-huh. She was the daughter of a dentist and gentleman farmer and politician whose name was DeKalb, D-E-C-A-L-V-E, DeKalb Bradford. And she and my father got married. He was assistant manager to the little movie theater in Acworth. In Atmore. Yeah, and that's where they met. Mm-hmm. Why a theater in a little town like that needs an assistant manager is way beyond me. But anyway, that was his job. And I have the feeling that she was a little bit of a wild child when she was young. I have nothing to back that up. Cecil himself was a nice-looking man, well set up, and had flame red hair, which accounts for why everybody in Acworth always called him Red. Mm-hmm. By the way, he was red, and until I went away to college, I was frequently Little Red. Okay. Which you can tell how much I'd love that. So, but she got sent off to what was then called a finishing school, Hudson College over in Alabama, where the girls who went to finishing school were supposed to learn. They were supposed to get basically a couple of years of education and some refinement and a little maturity. It was sort of getting ready to go find a husband school. Mm. And she ended up finding her husband and getting married. But my mother was very unusual and kind of a fish out of water in Acworth in some ways. I believe that when I was growing up, there were 2 sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica in town. The school had one, and we had the other one. And I'd ask my mother a question, and the invariable response would be, "Go look it up." And we spent a lot of time looking it up. Mm-hmm. She was very interested in world affairs, national politics, and the like. My older brother, the Georgia Tech brother, built her a Hallicrafter shortwave receiver, and she would listen late at night to Radio Prague and Radio Moscow and Radio this and Radio that all over Europe. Mm-hmm. And so she had sources of information and points of view that were unusual to say the least. And one of the things that all those radio outfits would do would be that if you'd write them and tell them you'd picked up their signal, if you were the farthest away, they would send you some little token prize, usually stamps for stamp collectors, things like that. So my mother would get all this mail from these Eastern European countries. I know that the postman thought that she was a communist. She had all this strange mail. But anyway, so she was a very active, she painted, was an amateur painter. She was a gardener. She and a few other folks around the state were trying to hybridize iris to create a black iris. She was never successful, but she kept hybridizing and moving the color darker and darker and darker. Never did quite get there. But she was a multi-talented, very smart lady. And as I said, she ended up at least lighting my tail on fire and that of my older brother and my younger brother. We were determined that we were going to do well. And I think from the time I was old enough to think, I knew I was going to college. I just didn't know where.
But your mother went to finishing school. Your father never went to college, I guess.
He had a couple of years at Georgia State,
Did he?
or so he claims. Daddy would sometimes tell a tale if you let him. But that's the story we had from him.
Okay. Well, Georgia State has an interesting history in those early days too. So, how did your mother? How did Mary Edith get condensed into Mary Ed?
Well, I think it's because when we were living in Atmore, her aunt Edith lived just down the block, and in order to distinguish Mary Edith from Mary Ed,
they pronounced it Edith.
Well, this particular Edith pronounced it Edith, and that was all that mattered. So to distinguish my mother from that other Edith, they shortened it.
Okay. I'd never heard it. I've always heard it pronounced Edith, I think.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of my lifetime around women who have two first names. So.
Yeah, that's pretty Southern, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like both of your parents were very technologically proficient in their own ways and interested in a lot of, certainly interested in education and what have you.
Education, certainly. I don't think I inherited many technological genes. My older brother, Van, went to Georgia Tech, and not quite a joke around the family is that all the smart ones in our family went to Georgia Tech, and the other ones went to Georgia, where I ended up.
That's a Georgia Tech joke, I think.
I'm sure.
Okay, so 43 you were born, 47 you're here. You go to Acworth Elementary, I guess.
Yes.
And North Cobb High School.
Correct.
And wait a minute, you had probably started in Acworth. You probably started your high school at Acworth School before North Cobb opened up.
I had 1 year at Acworth.
Okay.
Walter Flanagan says that he was in the first class that went all 4 years at North Cobb, and I think I was one class ahead of that.
Okay. How was that? I know not everybody in Acworth was excited about having to go to North Cobb High School compared to Acworth. What about you?
Well, I certainly wasn't real happy about it. It was the difference between a 3-block walk and driving to halfway to Kennesaw. So no, I don't think I was terribly excited about it, but I found high school to be an enjoyable time. Had some. North Cobb started out, because it was a brand new school, they were hiring a lot of fairly new teachers. And we had several just excellent teachers. And one of my favorites, as I mentioned earlier, I think, is Phil Roebuck. And Phil had I can call him Phil now that 50 years have gone by. I would never have called him Phil at the time. No. But Mr. Roebuck was a marvelous influence on me. He was so unusual. When you're in high school and you think of teachers, you think basically of old fogies, and that was not so with Phil. He had just gotten out of college. He was the same age as my older brother, for goodness sakes. I could hardly put my head around the fact that he was one of my teachers. But he was a dapper dresser, nice-looking guy, thin. He wore clothes like nobody's, but he could have worn a burlap bag and looked good at it. But he was always had a twinkle in his eye. The girls in the classes just ate him up, ate him alive. They loved him. And he was always engaged with the students. He drove a brand new car. Not very many people in Acworth had brand new cars at the time, but he had bought a brand new Plymouth, green and white. Remember it to this day. And he was just sort of the bee's knees. But what he did was give us an example that we could use. Those of us who were striving to go farther than we've gone so far, those of us who had college in mind, he gave us a role model. And there weren't a lot of those around Acworth at the time.
What did he teach?
I took basically civics from him. But just really a beacon for those of us who wanted to go farther.
Civics, of course, you can get into a lot of controversy in a civics class, I guess.
Not so much then, maybe now. Though.
Did he have a particular political philosophy that he articulated in the classroom?
None that I recall. I can't recall much about what he taught. I just recall the man.
Any other teachers that stand out from North Cobb or Acworth?
I had a biology teacher whose name I'm sorry I cannot recall, who I thought was very good. Until I ran into Phil Roebuck and got my exposure to civics, I thought I wanted to be a biology teacher in high school as a result of that fellow's work. Charlotte McClure, of course, was our guidance counselor. And she's the reason I ended up at the University of Georgia instead of going to Reinhardt Junior College.
Oh, Charlotte is the one.
Charlotte found the money. When it was time to start applying for colleges, my mother and I sat down and started figuring out what we would have to end up paying for this and paying for that. And it pretty quickly became evident that I wasn't going to have the money. And my father never earned a lot of money, certainly, and he didn't have the money to send me. So my mother and I decided that the best bet was that I would go to Reinhardt and commute over, live with my parents, choke, oh Lord, and commute to Reinhardt Junior College. I was bemoaning all this stuff to Miss Charlotte one afternoon, and she said, well, maybe there's something I can do. And about 6 or 8 weeks later, I got a call from her to come down to the office. So I go down, and she said, I think I may have helped solve the problem. What she had done was I had lost a thumb in a shotgun accident when I was 13 years old. And she had found a vocational rehabilitation scholarship from the University of Georgia, from the state of Georgia, that would pay my full tuition for 2 years. Well, tuition, not that was all that much. As I recall, tuition was $65 a quarter. Right. But it was still a huge amount considering, the resources we had. It made a tremendous difference. So went home with the good news, told my daddy what had happened, and he said, well, even that might not make it. I'm not sure we got enough to send you even with that. So about 2 weeks later, she came up with a $100 scholarship from the PTA, cash scholarship for the first year. So with that, Daddy said, well, I can give you $100. And if you'll come back every second or third or fourth weekend from the University of Georgia, hitchhike on back over here and work in the service station for me for a couple of days on the weekend, I'll pay you, $20 every time you do that. What do you think? Can you do it? And I said, well, we'll figure it out. So we did. I packed my bag and hitchhiked to Athens and dropped my bag in my dorm room and started looking for work and found a work waiting tables in one of the local eateries. And there was always seemed to be enough money to pay for whatever had to be paid for. There was never any left over, but...
But you lived very frugally.
I did, but Miss Charlotte had everything in the world to do with that one.
Any memories of growing up in Acworth that you'd like to talk about? You mentioned that the beach was under construction when you moved here. Did you go to the beach every weekend or go down there very much? Or?
Well, you can tell from my coloring that the beach and I probably don't get along real well. And even now, my wife and I over in South Carolina go to the beach, but we don't go over there until about 6 o'clock in the evening.
I see.
But believe it or not, I was hired for about 3 weeks as a lifeguard down at the beach. And I was always a tad on the tubby side and always on the pale side. Tubby side, believe me.
That's hard to believe.
Well, you work in my daddy's concession stand. He wouldn't pay me with money. He'd let me go in the concession stand and pick up a couple of candy bars or a bag of popcorn or whatever. No, I've had a weight problem my entire life.
Really? Then it's not obvious.
So in any event, I didn't last long in the lifeguarding job. I burned a beet red one afternoon, and my mother said, "You can't go back. You just can't go back." So there was that. I spent most of my spare time in high school working. Mm-hmm. When high school was over, I'd get in the car and drive down to the station, the service station. My father's service station, by the way, was the business next to the Big Chicken on Roswell Road, adjacent to the Big Chicken. Uh-huh. So I can always tell people where I worked as a teenager. Everybody knows where that is. Yeah. So I'd show up down there around 3:30 or 4 o'clock, and I'd work until 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and then head on home. And on the weekends, it was my job to open the station at 7 in the morning on Saturday and 7 in the morning on Sunday. And I'd work until 5 or 6 in the afternoon and close it down. Good. And while the drive-in theater was open before that, my job was to sell tickets up at the entrance and then later on to handle the popcorn machine and do all that stuff.
Well, it looks like the making for an entrepreneur.
I never went in that direction. Never went in the business direction. Well, that's not really true. A law firm is a business. Sure. We do actually have to run it occasionally.
Yeah. I know you've talked about cars in growing up, and what kind of cars did you have growing up?
Oh, you're going to be sorry you asked that question. I had 18 cars by the time I was 21 years old.
No, you're kidding.
And the deal was, in Georgia, when you're a boy and you turn 16, there's a law that says you have to go get your driver's license, and another law that says you have to go buy a car. So Daddy took me to get my driver's license, and then the next thing that we had to do was buy a car. Well, that service station was in the middle of 5 used car dealerships that ringed the Big Chicken. Mm-hmm. So Daddy handed me $75 and said, "Okay, go buy a car." And he knew all those guys, so they weren't going to take advantage of me. But I walked around looking at this and that and the other, and there were only about 5 cars available in that price range, which was sort of chump change price range. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up picking out a 1947 Ford two-door sedan that looked like an oversized Easter egg. It was light blue, and I don't know whether you remember those things. They were huge compared to today's cars.
Yeah.
Didn't have a front seat. The guy who had the thing loaned me a box, and I drove it the 150 yards to the station, and then hopped in a truck and drove to the junkyard, bought a seat for $5, and came back and bolted it in. Then went over to Sears Roebuck, and for $11.95 bought a set of seat covers, front and back, thank you. And I was in business. So that was the first one. I drove that one for probably a year. The one I had the longest, though, was a 1949 Ford Club Coupe, which was a pretty little car. But Daddy's rule, the reason I had so many cars was that Daddy's rule was whatever I was driving had to sit up on the front of the lot with a for sale sign in it all the time. So if he ever got a chance to turn it and make a few dollars, he'd do it. So when I drove to work in the afternoon, I never knew whether I'd be walking home that night or driving something different or whatever.
Wow. Why don't you talk a little bit about the culture in Acworth in those days? How would you describe life in Acworth? We did an interview a few minutes ago where he was talking about how sheltered life was when he was growing up. How would you describe life in Acworth?
Probably the best description I can give you. When I wrote this book of memories about Acworth growing up, I shared the stories as I was writing them with my son, Brian. And Brian gave me what I thought was one of the best compliments I've ever had. He said it made him nostalgic for a time he hadn't lived through.
That's great.
And I thought that was it was an innocent time. There were the quote good kids in town were not beer drinkers, hell raisers. I think I had my first beer after I got to the University of Georgia and had been there for 6 months, and even then it didn't agree with me very much. And the girls we dated were nice girls. They were my current wife was a prime example. She was just had a reputation as a young lady. That's what she was. And so many of the young girls who lived in Acworth had that reputation. The nice girls were really nice girls. They behaved themselves, and the guys behaved themselves for the most part. The social life of the town sort of centered around the churches. And my parents, when they first showed up, went to the First Baptist Church. Well, they got at loggerheads with the church because the church had the position that theaters should not be open on Sunday afternoon. So the minister at the First Baptist Church decided he was going to make that his project to close the theater on Sunday. So he went to Daddy and said, you know, it's the Lord does not want businesses to be open on Sunday afternoon. And Cecil basically said, the Lord may not want it, but Martin Theaters, they write my paycheck. They want it, so I got to do it. The nod that Martin Theaters gave to that kind of Southern religious fervor was that they wouldn't open until 2 o'clock to give everybody time to go home and have lunch. And come in. So we opened the theater at 2 o'clock on Sunday, and that went on for a bit, and the preacher railed and railed and railed. And finally one day my mother and father were at church, seated near the back as they usually are, and the preacher got himself into a real stem-winding fit and railing about the theater being open on Sundays, and finished his oration by saying, "And the devil has red hair."
Oh, sure, no.
And from that point on, my parents did not go back to the Baptist church. They would send us over there for Sunday school, but they decided they probably weren't all that welcome.
But you kept going there for Sunday school.
Oh, yes.
So, okay.
You know, nice kids had to go to Sunday school. So
so they didn't change churches.
That's right.
They just
No.
stopped going. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think they'd ever darken the door again.
Yeah, well, I can understand after that welcome.
No, it was a different time. It really was. The advent of television killed the theater and killed the drive-in. And it was at about that point, I think that was about 1959, when those two businesses both went under. And my father, with his brother's help, ended up with the service station down in Marietta.
Right. And so you were about a sophomore in high school at that.
Yep. I had the privilege of pumping gas for people in the shadow of the Big Chicken for 3 or 4 years.
Did he own the building that the Legion Theater was in?
Yes, he did.
So.
But I think he lost it when the theater went under.
Really?
I'm not really sure. I never knew much about my father's finances, but I'm betting that's the case. My younger brother owned it for a short period. He later.
Your younger brother?
My younger brother Rick, who is a cabinet maker here in Acworth.
He owned the building?
The building, But he didn't own it for long, a short number of years, I think.
What's in it now, where the theater was?
I don't recall.
Okay, that's all right.
Yeah, there was the Silver Trolley was right next to it. I do remember that much.
Yeah.
It was on the same block with the Allen's Five and Dime store.
Right.
We sort of anchored the other end of the block. And then, as I recall, there was a bit of a gap. And then there was a furniture store and the post office on down at the end.
Yeah. And the drive-in theater goes under in 59 also?
Yes, they both went under at the same time. Television just wiped out that industry for a while.
So 59, I guess it was about 1963, the first time that I drove through here. And I remember, I think the Kmart had just opened up about that time, early 60s. You'd been in college by that time, I guess.
Which Kmart?
There was
the one on Roswell Road.
Chicken, yeah.
Yes, I worked in the sporting goods department of that Kmart for about 3 months.
Okay, and I remember, of course, Pine Forest was across the street, down a little bit. All those apartments that actually there were apartments right in the front that you could stay in like a motel, and then the duplexes all back through there. You get many customers out of there?
I didn't really know much about where the customers were from. The only customer I knew much about was the one that Daddy got. He managed to win a contract cleaning out trucks you used to haul chickens in.
Yeah.
And you can imagine who got to do that work. I remember that customer pretty well, but the rest not so much.
Yeah. Okay. So, so you go off, and your career's away from here after that, but your younger brother stays in Acworth, I guess, after Vietnam. Do you want to talk about your brothers a little bit?
Sure. Let's start with the younger brother.
Okay.
And I think he would be a very good one to do one of these interviews, actually. But let me tell you what little I know about.
Okay.
You never know. You never know how little or how much you know about people until you start talking about them. So he may have some corrections to make.
Okay.
But in the middle of the Vietnam War, he gets drafted, and as luck would have it, he got sent off to Germany to be a missile fire control crewman.
Okay.
Spent his entire enlistment in Germany during the Vietnam War. Comes home. He had gone to junior college, but he was not terribly academically successful. He's not built that way. He's very, very smart and a wonderful businessman, and does extremely well at his finally chosen career. But he came back and he started doing framework for people building houses up in the mountains for wealthy Atlanta folks.
Yeah.
So he would help frame houses, and then started doing finer and finer and finer work, and ended up as a cabinet maker. And his cabinet shop is up on Highway 92. The older brother is a nuclear physicist. Well, he's retired now, but he spent years at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in California, which is where the U.S. nuclear weapons were designed and built. And he worked directly for Dr. Edward Teller, who ran the Rad Lab.
Wow.
So Van made bombs for a long time, basically.
Wow.
Interesting guy. He was always exploring various religions and whatnot. Started off as a Southern Baptist, ended up as an Episcopalian, and is currently a Buddhist.
Okay.
He's an interesting interview.
I bet. Wow. What about Lily Grace? What can you say about her in her early days, maybe in Acworth?
Well, I was talking about, she lived in Marietta.
Okay.
I was dating out of a league. I was dating those Marietta girls.
I see.
Who were known to be noticeably several notches up the social ladder. So, but I started dating Lily Grace when I was a sophomore. I was 17 years old. And we dated for 5 years. And Lily Grace, nice girl that she was, never went steady with anybody. She kept all the boys on the hook all the time. And she was a force of nature. You dated her, you got taught how to behave in public. There's an interesting chapter in the book called The Little Purse, which will show you how she did that. But she basically helped raise me, for lack of a better term. We would date, the sort of strange dates. We spent a lot of time going down to the Theater Under the Stars at Chastain Memorial Park. I had season tickets to the Chastain Under the Stars series in the summer. We would go down and see the Broadway plays as they were on tour for the first time, or as they were tuning up to go to Broadway. Spent a lot of times at the movies. I remember one particular movie we saw was South Pacific. She had been to see South Pacific the previous night with another date. I found out 10 years later. But she didn't squeal to me. She behaved as if it were her first time in the theater. Classy lady. Absolutely classy lady. She was a businesswoman in Atlanta for years, ran a newspaper for women in Atlanta for 7 years before we were married, and I dragged her up to Washington, D.C.
How did South Pacific go over with the Southern audience?
You know, I know the songs you're thinking about and the plot line you're talking about, but I don't. First place, I don't think it was cut for Southern audiences. I think they showed the same version all across the country, and I never heard any tremendous backlash about it. Of course, that might have had something to do with the crowd I was running with.
Interesting. How did segregation work in Acworth when you were growing up?
You are asking the wrong guy. I mean, there was almost no meeting of the races in my early life. The young black elementary school kids went somewhere, I do not know where. The young black high school kids got bused to a school, again, away from here, I don't know where. We would occasionally, of course, we had black patrons at the theater occasionally. Occasionally, we would have my mother would be able to afford for a brief period of time a maid. She was sick at one point, had a maid who came in. But there was almost no racial interaction that I can recall. I believe I recall. I'm not sure that this. Sometimes when you're very young, you lose track of what's memory and what you've picked up from those B-grade movies you watched for so long. But I think I recall a Klan parade in Georgia in about 1950, 51, 52, right about there. I could be mistaken about that, but I think I recall such a thing. I remember standing on the street watching all these folks go by.
Yeah. Well, they were certainly around at the time.
They were.
I've heard some tales, similar tales of some guys that worked that really opened up the Lockheed plant that came from California. And vivid memories of the Klan around the square in Marietta and down on US 41.
I will mention to you that, now I just recall my first year at the University of Georgia was 1961. That was the year the university was integrated.
Yeah.
Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes.
Right, and that would have been integrated in January, and you came in September, I guess. Right?
Well, I came in September.
Yeah.
I was not aware that they had been there earlier. You may well be right about that.
January
Yeah.
that they...
I defer to you on that. I just know that they were there while I was there.
Yeah. Did you ever see them?
Occasionally, but not often.
Ever have a chance to talk to them?
Nope. They weren't. I don't think I ever shared a classroom with them.
Were there any other black students that were in your classes at Georgia?
No. Not then.
And what were you majoring in at Georgia?
Well, I started out majoring in Civil War history, and was going to. I was pushing toward a credential that would permit me to teach that in college. And then someone pointed out that it required a foreign language, which is not anything I know how to do. So I started casting around for other majors, and I found that the education department did not require a foreign language, so I promptly transferred. And ended up with that master's degree in social science research. Basically glorified statistician.
Okay.
Went to work for the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington, D.C.
Oh, really?
Which almost instantly dissolved and became the National Transportation Safety Board. So I was a statistician and a writer for them for 5 years while I went to Georgetown Law School at night.
And then you had a successful legal career that I guess are you still in practice, or are you totally retired?
No, I'm still at it, much to the consternation of my partners, but yes, I'm still at it. I spend most of my time writing and speaking to groups and drumming up business. That's basically what I do these days. I practice very little law anymore.
When you come back to Acworth now, what's your impression of Acworth today compared to Acworth 50 years ago?
In some ways, the place seemed healthier 50 years ago. And by healthier, I mean, if you look, this is true, it's not just Acworth, it's true of a whole bunch of rural communities all across the country. But the effect of Walmart and the other big box stores and places like that has just had a terrible effect on the downtown commerce of so many places. When I say it's healthy, I mean we had the dime store, 2 drug stores, a Western Auto store, at least 2 doctors, at least 2 pharmacies, several just plain drug stores, and 1 supermarket, pool hall, barbershops, just a thriving little downtown farm community. That's what it was then. Now, of course, it seems to be bedroom community-based, tourist-based, the antique stores and things like that. I mean, that's fine, but it just has a different feel to it.
Well, anything that you would like to say for this interview about anything that we haven't talked about? We were talking about Dr. Cobble before we got started on the interview, for instance. Any people in this area that were notable to you?
Well, the people who were important in my life, Dr. Caldwell was certainly one of them. He was the one who diagnosed me at age 12 or 13 as having rheumatic fever, and he was the initial one to treat me for it and sentenced me to bed rest for a year. And my sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Blair, was responsible for me not missing any school during that year. She would come to our house once a week and go through lesson plans, whatnot, with my mother. Helen Hartley was a teacher at, I think, Acworth first, and then at the I'm not sure she transferred to North Cobb or not, but also she was a very important, bright young woman and a big influence on me. The band leader here, my older brother and I were both in the bands, and he was a nice, very good fellow. Had a lot of trying to think of other people in the community. T.C. Cantrell, of course, who was the original principal. Mr. Keenel, who lived across from us, where my little brother lives now. Mr. Keenel and his brood were always wonderful folks, good friends to have.
You're talking about the Fred Keenel, the elder, or
Bobby.
Or Bobby. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I wish I'd had time to set that question up a little bit.
That's fine. That's good. Well, I think I'm about out of questions, unless you've got anything you'd like to add.
Well, read the book and call me and we'll talk.
All right. Sounds like a winner.
And there's another 40 pages behind that for the sequel. So.
Oh, you got a sequel?
Oh yeah, I never quit writing.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's good.
The way the book started out. Do you have time?
Sure.
Yeah.
You still got it running.
Yeah, it's still running.
Yeah, the way the book started out was I started thinking about my children and my grandchildren and their relationship with my parents. And I realized that my grandchildren had never met my parents. They had never existed on the earth at the same time my parents had. So I thought, why don't I write a few stories to give my grandchildren some idea of what my parents were like and where they came from. So I started writing and came up with 6 or 8 or 10 stories, and then it just kind of got out of hand. And it turned into a lot more than just a description of them, but turned into sort of growing up in Acworth and then going off to Georgia and then going off to Washington, D.C. I mean, you talked about a more innocent time. You have never seen a bigger rube than I was, going from Acworth to Athens, Georgia. And then the exact same thing applied when I went from Athens, Georgia to Washington, D.C. I was as green as they come and was constantly in a state of amazement, basically. So writing about all that stuff it just kept on growing and growing and growing. So that's where the book came from.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it.
I did too.